In this section, we'll look at the war from the point it began on September 1st, 1939 with the attack on Poland through the summer of 1940 with the fall of France. The German attack on Poland involved 2,000 tanks and 1,000 airplanes. It was a coordinated attack known as Blitzkrieg. It used tanks and airplanes and infantry all connected through radio in a way that had never been before. Blitzkrieg meant lightning war. The first wave was an aerial assault of bombers, included the famous Stuka dive bombers, which could fly low and drop a bomb accurately and then escape from anti-aircraft fire. This bombing would cut lines of communication and transportation, as well as hitting command and control facilities. The result paralyzed the Polish defenders, many of whom still carried World War I era rifles. Next came the armored assaults, with tanks moving along major corridors into populated areas. Again, all of this was coordinated. Finally, in the third wave came infantry, thereby minimizing casualties. The Poles fought hard, but were overwhelmed in a matter of weeks, ultimately. They held on in Warsaw, which was encircled and absolutely decimated. True to their agreement, the Soviets invaded eastern Poland on September 17, 1939. The demarcation line for the German and Soviet parts of Poland was along the Bug River. By late October, Germany had officially annexed the western sections of Poland, West Prussia, Poznan, Upper Silesia, and the former free city of Danzig. The remainder of German-occupied Poland, including Warsaw, was organized as the so-called general government. Of course, the general government in Poland was controlled by the Germans, who appointed a civilian Nazi, Hans Frank, to rule over it. As Poland capitulated, the Soviet Union used the opportunity to attack neighboring Finland. The Soviets had 3 times as many soldiers as the Finns, and 35 times rather, the number of aircraft. In what became known as the Winter War, however, the Finns fought bravely and inflicted heavy losses on the Soviets. Finally, in March 1940, however, the Finns had to concede in the Moscow Peace Treaty of 1940. The Finns had to give up more than 11% of its land. With Britain and France declaring a blockade of Germany, Germany deployed its U-boats in the Atlantic. The result was the beginning of what British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Atlantic. The battle reached its peak in mid-1940, but continued until late 1943. Estimates have been that it involved thousands of ships in more than 100 individual convoy battles and as many as 1,000 individual single-ship encounters. The war theater, of course, covered thousands of square miles of ocean, and each side constantly readjusted the tactics and strategies throughout the war. The Germans organized the U-boats in what German Admiral Erich Raeder termed wolf packs. Long lines of U-boats would systematically patrol a designated grid to locate and sink Allied merchant and military shipping. U-boats had been used in World War I, but the newer versions could stay underwater longer and they could travel faster, and they were definitely more deadly. In October 1939, as the Battle of Atlantic began, the United States joined a number of Central and South American republics to sign the Declaration of Panama. The nations proclaimed a continuous, quote, safety zone around all of the Americas, North, Central, and South America, excluding Canada. In this zone, which ranged from 250 miles to over 1,200 miles, the signatory nations agreed to mutually police and prevent any acts of aggression. The Declaration of Panama, again, did not mention U-boats, but its clear intent was against the Nazis and to prevent U-boats into the perimeter. The outbreak of the European War strengthened FDR's interventionist pro-Allied policies. With the isolationists weakened, FDR was able to get Congress to pass, in a fierce debate, the Neutrality Act of 1939. Now, unlike the other earlier neutrality acts, this was clearly a more partisan and less truly neutral. The new law allowed the trade of arms and munitions to countries at war, but only on a cash and carry basis. And of course, FDR and Congress knew that Germany's strength was its army and U-boats, not its surface fleet or merchant marine fleet. Britain, by contrast, had an excellent navy. The result, therefore, would be that while the Neutrality Act of 1939 was neutral technically, it favored the British because only Britain could have crossed the Atlantic and do a cash and carry trade. Just after the Finnish Winter War was concluded, the Germans invaded Norway and Denmark in early April 1940, proclaiming that Germans would protect them from the British and French. In fact, Denmark was a staging area for the attack on Norway. Norway offered Germans the vast access to the oceans that Germany's navy and U-boats needed. The Germans didn't attack Sweden because there was no need. Encircled, however, by the Nazis, Sweden granted access to the Nazis. Denmark quickly capitulated, but the Norwegians still held on for 2 months, until mid-June 1940. After Britain and France declared war on Germany, there was no direct attack on those two countries outside of the Battle of the Atlantic. Britain and France, while trying to aid the Norwegians and the Danish, didn't directly attack Germany either. Many people in Britain and France began to optimistically refer to a, quote, phony war, hopeful that while war was declared, Hitler actually just wanted Poland away in Norway, Poland and Norway, not Britain and France. He would not attack them, they hoped, and a negotiated peace might result. The British government, of course, kept preparing for war, distributing gas masks to civilians and warning its citizens to remain vigilant. In fact, Hitler was waiting until the spring when warm, dry weather was more conducive to his blitzkrieg. He also had to move his troops in the east and Poland and in, of course, the Scandinavian countries, to the Western Front staging areas on France. The French felt secure behind a line of massive fortifications near the German border, the Maginot Line, named for the French Minister of War André Maginot. The line included concrete underground fortifications impervious to bombing. It included state-of-the-art living conditions for the troops, including air-conditioned and underground railroads. The line stretched from the Swiss Alps to Luxembourg, but it didn't extend across the Belgian border to the sea for fear of violating Belgium's declared neutrality. The Maginot Line took almost all of the 1930s to construct at a cost of more than 3 billion French francs. Of course, the Maginot Line proved anachronistic in the age of blitzkrieg. The Germans ended the phony war by attacking through Belgium on May 10, 1940, essentially bypassing the Maginot Line. The Germans also attacked Holland, which had been neutral in World War I. The defenders were overwhelmed, 300,000 French and British troops lucky to escape to Britain along the coast of at Dunkirk, carried to Britain, by the way, by many private boats across the English Channel. By the end of May, both Belgium and Holland had surrendered. The Nazis quickly began rounding up the Jewish populations in the countries they controlled. When they began rounding up Jews in Holland in 1942, one Jewish family, the Franks, began hiding in the attic of their Amsterdam home. There, the family's 13-year-old daughter Anne began keeping a diary of her life. The family was betrayed in 1944 and sent to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where most died, including Anne. After the war, the only survivor, Otto Frank, returned to Amsterdam and found Anne's diary had survived. He published it in 1947 and it was published in England in English in 1952 as the, quote, Diary of a Young Girl, and it remains a bestseller and is used in many classes in World War II today. With the army in chaos and with thousands of refugees fleeing the Nazis, France signed an armistice on June 22, 1940. Hitler made the French surrender in the same railroad car that the Germans had surrendered in during World War I. Hitler visited Paris and was filmed stamping his foot, which the Allied war reels said that Hitler was dancing on France. In any event, Hitler was proclaimed a real hero in Germany. With 27,000 Germans killed and 18,000 missing, Germany had lost only a third of the casualties he had suffered in just the Battle of the Verdun during World War I. War fever and euphoria swept through the German public, and Hitler's popularity reached an all-time high. After the armistice, German troops occupied all of the north and west of France, the most populated regions, including Paris. Italy was given a small section in the eastern part of France. To govern the rest, the Germans established a government at Vichy, France, led by the elderly World War I general Marshal Pétain. The Frenchman Pétain acquiesced to whatever Germany demanded, and after the war he was tried as a traitor. Convicted, he was first sentenced to death, but later he had his sentence commuted to life in prison, and he died at the age of 95 in 1951. Of course, not all the French acquiesced. Under the leadership of General Charles de Gaulle, so-called Free French forces would reconvene in Great Britain, and they participated in the rest of the war. In the occupied portions of France, groups of armed men and women began secretly organizing to undermine the occupation. This French resistance provided military intelligence to the Allies and coordinated acts of sabotage in the electrical power grid or the transportation infrastructure or communication facilities. Later, they helped they lay the foundation for the Allied invasion of D-Day. The French resistance grew as the war progressed. Ultimately, there were as many as 400,000 people by the end of 1944. German punishment for those caught was swift and severe, often imprisonment in concentration camps or execution. By the fall of France in the summer of 1940, the interventionists in the United States, those who advocated aiding the Allies, actually outnumbered the shrinking number of isolationists. Like the isolationists earlier, who had organized the group America First, the interventionists formed their own lobby in the mid-1940s. Named the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, the group quickly began lobbying for concrete actions to help the British. This concludes this section of World War II from its beginning in 1939 until the summer of 1940.